Okay, so in this video we're going to talk about how to find the percent of a number. So what we're looking for here is we know the percent, we know the whole. We're just looking for what piece of that whole would represent the percentage that the question's asking for. Now, if before we start, if you don't think you know how to convert between percents and percents and fractions or percents and decimals, take a moment to go watch the previous video that we posted that was just on how to convert between percents and fractions, fractions and percents and decimals percents. Take a moment to watch that video first, at least skim it. Make sure you understand how to convert between them, because you're going to need to be able to do that in order to do these calculations and these examples. So as a brief explanation, I want you guys to know, when we find the percent of a number, both these examples say find 25% of 80, find 15% of 200. What number is 15% of 200? They're using two different ways of saying the same thing. For both of them, you're going to essentially do that percentage times the number, times the whole. So 25% times 80, 15% times 200. It's just like in chapter 2 when we talked about taking the fraction of something. A fraction of something means that fraction times that something. It applies here. A percent of something means that percent times that something. So as a brief background, remember that the word percent means out of 100. Out of 100. Now that'll make more sense when you look at questions where we convert the percent to a fraction. We put that percentage over 100 because it's out of 100, and then simplify that fraction, and now you're ready to go. So in this first example, we're going to find 25% of 80. We're going to do this one using the fraction method, and then we're going to do the second one using the decimal method. Those are the two methods mainly that you can use to find the percent of a number. So like I said, the first one was the fraction method, the second one was the decimal method. The one that I prefer, the one that's the most versatile, the one that always works without getting ugly, is going to be the decimal method. So if there was one that you wanted to pick as your favorite, pick that you know always works even when the numbers are ugly, that's going to be the decimal method. That's one that always works. All right, so let's take a look at example 1. It says find 25% of 80. I already mentioned you got to convert that to a fraction or a decimal first. We're doing this using the fraction method, so we'll convert that to a fraction first. So I already mentioned earlier how we convert that. And if you need more help converting that, go take a look at one of the previous video I uploaded specifically on that old skill. So 25 over 100 simplifies 1 over 4. So now 1 over 4 times 80. That means you're just going to use your fraction skills. You're going to do 1 over 4 times 80. So using your fraction skills, that means times 80. 80 doesn't have a denominator. Give it a denominator. So you're really doing 1 over 4 times 80 over 1. So whether you use the shortcut at this point is up to you, or you can just multiply straight across. So 1 times 80, that's going to equal 80. I'll go up here. And then 4 times 1 equals 4. Now you have 80 over 4, so that's 80 divided by 4, and that's going to give you 20. And that's the same answer they said. Now I didn't use the fraction multiplying shortcut here. I don't want to confuse you with more things, but I just wanted you to know it works the same way with multiplying fractions. So that's the same answer that they got. That's the fraction method. Turn the percentage into a fraction, then multiply. Then there's the decimal method. In the decimal method, you're first going to take that percentage, you're going to convert it to a decimal. So 15% becomes 0.15, 0.15. So as a brief reminder, we learned in that previous video that if you're going to go from a percent to a decimal, you're always going to move 2 decimal places to the left. So imagine your decimal place going 2 spaces to the left. So that was a really ugly drawing. Try that again. So there, stop erasing, bad pen. There's your decimal, move 2 spaces to the left. There we go. And so that's how you're always going to convert. So with that 15%, there's no mentioning of a decimal, so it's after the 5, move 2 times. And that's why the decimal is now in front of the 1. So it's 0.15. So you can use your decimal skills, or you use a calculator at this point. In this chapter, I don't mind you guys using calculators. We're focusing more on the problem-solving aspect. So 0.15, you either do it with a calculator, do it with long multiplication. Multiply that by 200, you're going to get 30. And that's going to be how you find 15% of 200. In my opinion, the one that takes the least amount of work is probably the decimal method, based on whether you have a calculator available. Sometimes you don't, sometimes you do. When in doubt, you can always use either method, whichever one works for you. They both technically always work, just that the fraction method sometimes gets a little ugly with certain numbers where you have like mixed numbers. It can get kind of tough. So here's what we're gonna do. We're gonna use these two methods, and we're gonna try to just pick one or the other for each of the few examples we're gonna do. So we're gonna do several examples, and then for each one, we're just gonna decide which method do we think would be a little bit easier. Because if it's a pretty percent, by pretty I mean easy number that we know how many times 25% goes into 100, it's really easy to convert that one to a fraction. And then in our heads, when we say 1/4 of something, we're really just saying what goes into it 4 times. Whereas with 15%, turning that one into a fraction isn't really a pretty fraction. I mean, it'll turn into a fraction. It'd be 15 over 100, which would turn into 3 over 20. But that's not really a fraction that a lot of us would do really fast rounding in our heads. So I would not recommend doing this one with the fraction method. And that's why I mentioned sometimes one's better than the other. So let's take a look at a few examples. Before I do each example, hit pause and try it first on your own. Alright, so if you think you got the hang of this, hit pause and see if you can do these 3 examples first on your own. Using whichever method you prefer. I don't have a preference as your math teacher. They both work. So take a moment. Alright, so take a look at both of these. 55% at a glance isn't really going to turn into a pretty fraction that we would be able to easily, quickly do. So I'm gonna lean towards the decimal method for the first one. And for the second method, I'm going to say the same thing. I'm going to lean towards the decimal method is what we're going to multiply. And for the last one, for 8%, well, let's see, 8% is 8 over 100, which simplifies to 2 over 25. Still not quite a pretty fraction that we want to be able to work with to multiply. So I'm going to go ahead and avoid that one. Even though it does technically work, maybe I'll take a moment just to quickly show you in case you prefer that method, just to let you know. But I am going to lean towards the fraction method, the decimal method for each of these. So first things first, we got to turn this into a decimal, move it over twice, so that makes it 0.55. We're going to multiply that by 400. So use your calculator, use long multiplication. I don't care how you do it, but see what that equals. So I'll come back to do that in a moment. But I just want to set each of these up because I want you to pay special attention to how we calculate each of them. Now for the next one, 190%, the decimal is currently there because there was no mention of it, so it's at the very end. Move it twice. So that means it's going to become 1.9. So to answer that one, you're going to have 1.9 or 1.90, means the same thing. You're going to have 1.9 times 20. And that's what you're going to do for that one. For each of these questions, especially on your homework, I want to make sure that you write and know what you're actually multiplying to get your answer. That way you know how to make that conversion. Now for the last example, what is 8% of 300? Move that decimal over twice. There's a blank spot, so it's going to be filled with a 0. So that's going to be 0.08 multiplied by 300. So now take a moment to go back with a calculator or with long multiplication, doesn't matter, and fill in each of these answers, because that's what I'm about to do. Alright, so I went back and just used a calculator real fast to calculate each of these. So 0.55 times 400, that gave us 220, so that's going to be the answer to that question, 220. 1.9 times 20 gives us 38, and then 0.08 times 300 gives us 24. Before I move on past these questions, I want to make sure you know how to make sure your answers are reasonable. For example, in this question, it was what is 55% of 400? I want you to kind of maybe base this off a quick estimation of maybe what is half. So we know 55% is just over half because half is 50%. So just over half. So that means the answer, because this is our whole, this is the whole number, this is the whole pie, our answer has got to be a little bit more than half of 400 since our percentage was a little bit more than half. So half of 400 is 200, and so we're expecting an answer a little bit more than 200. So 220 is a reasonable answer. Those of you maybe make mistakes with your decimal places and don't do these right, if you end up with something like 2,200 or 22,000, numbers like that, you lost track of your decimal place and your answer is not reasonable. For example, 22,000 is huge compared to this, whereas 55% is less than all of it, because remember, 100% is all of it. So make sure your answers are reasonable. And the second one, 190%, well, that's more than 100%. So we're expecting an answer that's bigger than our number. And in fact, it's almost 200%, which means our answer should be almost 2 times the size of the original. The original was 20, so almost 2 times that. Well, 2 times that's 40. So we're expecting an answer just under 40. And that was reasonable with what we received. So 38 is a reasonable answer. Lastly, on the ones on the screen, 8%, that's a really small percentage. So we're expecting a very small number in comparison to the whole. Now, if it was 8% of 100, 8% of 100 is just 8. And then, so 8% out of 300 is just take 8 times 3. And so 8 times 3, hey, that's 24. So that's another way to know this answer is reasonable. Or just say, I know it's going to be something that's a very small portion of 300, but it's probably not going to be a decimal tiny, like less than 1, because this number is bigger than 100. So that tells you you're expecting an answer. This is in the ballpark. So these answers are reasonable. So let's do a few more examples. Before I move on, I did say that I would at least remind you of the fraction method. So I'm going to do that last example using the fraction method. So 8% out of 300, we first have to turn that 8% into a fraction, which means put 8 over 100. And so converting that one to a fraction, we would simplify top and bottom by 4, it would appear. 4 goes in 8 2 times, 4 goes into 100 25 times. So that's going to turn into 2 over 25. So we would take 2 over 25, since that represents 8%, we're going to multiply that by 300. So what we're going to do is we're going to have 2 over 25 multiplied by 300. So 300 needs a denominator, so remember, if it doesn't have one, you can make it a 1. Now, because these numbers are so large, I am going to use the fraction shortcut when multiplying fractions, just to make this easier, so it doesn't seem so daunting. So let's use the fraction shortcut when multiplying fractions. It's that cross simplifying method. 2 and 1 do not simplify, but 25 and 300 does. 25 goes into 25 one time. 25 goes into 300. Let's see, 25 goes into 100 4 times. So it goes into 300 times that by 3, so 12 times. So 25 goes into 300 12 times. So now go ahead and multiply straight across. 2 times 12 is 24. 1 times 1 is going to be 1. So we have 24 over 1. Well, that just equals 24. And that agrees with what we did down there with the decimal method. So once you know the fraction method, it technically always works. Just sometimes it may not be quite as pretty of a fraction to deal with. But it does also work. All right, so out of this one, we're going to do the top example and the bottom example. You'll notice what both of them have in common is that they both have decimal percentages. The first one is 12.5%, and then the second one is 0.25%. I want to show you that it still works no matter what. That's what we're going to do. All right, so in the first one, what is 12.5% of 60? Hit pause if you think you've already got that one, and take a moment to give it a shot. And make sure you know what you're multiplying to get your answer. Well, the first thing we've got to do is we've got to move that decimal place over twice to turn it into a decimal. So that makes it 0.125. Well, that's what we're going to multiply by 60. And this is what I want you to be able to at least be able to write for each of your questions. You have to at least write, what are you going to multiply? So see what that equals, and that'll be your answer. We'll come back to that one. I want to set up the next one. 0.25%. Well, now that one, we've got to move it over twice, just like before. So it starts off here, so move twice. So it's going to end right there where that dot was. So we have a space. So that space is going to have to get a 0 in it. So that's going to turn into 0. That's 0 for the space, and then the other 0, 25. So that's what 0.25% looks like as a decimal. And that is what we are going to multiply 42 by to get our answers. So for each of these, do long multiplication or use a calculator. We are allowed to use calculators at this point for this step. So if that's the method you're going to use, it's the one I'm going to use. That's perfectly reasonable, so that's not an issue. So 0.125 times 60, well, that's going to give us 7.5. And now 7.5, let's see, 12.5%. Well, we know 25% is 1/4. 25% is 1/4. And 1/4 of 60 is 15. So this is less than that. So in fact, this is exactly half of 25%. So exactly half of 15 is 7.5. I didn't mean to actually do that precisely, but just to know that our answer is less than a quarter or way less than half. That means our answer should be less than a quarter or way less than half of 60. So 7.5 is a reasonable answer. And that's what I wanted to point out to you guys. Make sure your answers are reasonable. It doesn't take but a moment to figure that out. Now over here, we get down at the bottom, we do 0.0025, 0025 times 42. And that's going to give us an answer of 0.105. Now, that's a pretty small number, so we got to make sure that number is reasonable. We take a look over here. It was 0.25%, so it was less than 1% of 42. Well, 1% of 42 would have been 0.42. That would have been 1% of 42. This is less than 1% of 42. So our answer has got to be less than 0.42. So 0.105 is less than 0.42. Remember, place value. That says 0.4. That starts off with 0.1. So 0.4 is a lot bigger. So this answer is reasonable. It's quite small, but that's what we were expecting. So that's a quick way to make sure that answer was reasonable. So take a moment to reflect on these two examples. We're going to probably do about 3 more, then we'll be all done. All right, we're going to do the top question on the screen. It says 225% of 16. So we're going to do the same thing we did before. We're going to convert it to a decimal. So the decimal's there at the very end since it's not mentioning one. Move it twice, so it becomes 2.25. So we're going to multiply by 2.25, which means our answer is going to get bigger than the original because 16 was the original. But that makes sense because 225% is more than 200%, so it should get bigger. So we're going to multiply that, and you're welcome to use a calculator to help you do that. So on your homework and your assignments, I want to make sure that you take the time to write what you're multiplying. So 2.25 times 16, that's going to equal 36. And that's going to be our answer to this question. We were expecting an answer that was more than 2 times the size of 16. So 200% would be 16 times 2, which would have been 32. But this is 225%, so there's an extra 25%. So if you had found 25% of 16, that's 1/4 of 16, or 4. 32 plus 4, well, that gives us 36. So that's another way where you could have broken that question up to help you do it, whether you're doing it mentally or by hand. So take a moment to reflect on that example. We've got 2 more. We're all done, guys. All right, we're going to do the 2 circled examples at the top, number 17 and number 18. Number 17 says 5/6% of 600. And the instructions say find each number, round to the nearest hundredth if necessary. So 5/6% of 600. Well, that's kind of silly. We have a fraction percent. Well, just let's eyeball this real fast. 5/6, that's less than 1 because 6 over 6 would be 1. So that's less than 1% is what they're asking us to do of 600. We can't really do that until we know what is 5/6 as a decimal. So 5/6 as a decimal, I just did 5 divided by 6 is what I just did on my calculator. 5 divided by 6. That told me 0.8 and then a bunch of 3's going on forever. The 3's are repeating. So to convert, so now we haven't actually turned that to a percentage from a percent yet. So that is still a percent. That is still a percent. So we still have to convert it to a decimal that we can use. So from where the decimal currently is, to make it, since that's our percentage, to now make this percentage into a decimal, remember we move it 2 places to the left. Okay, so whenever you turn from a percentage to a decimal, you got to get smaller. So the way to get smaller is going to the left. So to the left. So we're going to have a space right there. That's where it's going to end up. So that decimal that we're going to end up using is 0. Now the 0 that goes here and that current 0, so that's 2 zeros, then the 8. That's the decimal that we're going to be using. But you'll notice we have a bunch of those 3's. So I'm just going to include, I don't know, 2 of them. And then at this point we don't have a choice but to kind of round if we're going to use the decimal method to do this. So I want to show you what this looks like. So that's what we're going to multiply 600 by. So that times 600. So I'm going to type that into the calculator, see what that gives us. So 0.00833 times 600. Okay. All right, that gives us 4.99. Now, if you had included more of those 3's, if you included more 3's, you would have gotten 999999999. You would have eventually gotten an 8 where it rounded on you because you can't keep typing 3's in for the rest of your life. So this answer is 4.9999. It wants to keep going up. And you'll notice because we rounded, that 4.999, in fact, this one equals 4.998, it keeps going. It wants to be 5, but it's not able to be because we technically rounded at this step. Because of that, you're not going to get the exact answer with the decimal method, but be aware when you get answers like that where it's like 0.9999 something, it really is the number that it's right next to. So go ahead and choose that number. So you're not rounding when you say that the answer is 5. You're not rounding when you say that. We got this original number because we rounded, and so I just want you guys to know reasonably when you get answers like that, it's really because it's supposed to be the 5, and that's why it's really, really close to the 5. The more you don't round at this step, the closer it'll be to the 5. Now, if you would use the fraction method for this question, you could have. In fact, that would have kept you from having to round. You could have done it this way. You could have done 5/6 out of 100. So we just turned that percentage into a fraction. Well, this fraction is kind of ugly, so we need to get rid of this 6. You can get rid of that 6 by remembering what we said, how to get rid of fractions and right here. If you want to get rid of that 6, that means divided by 6, you can get rid of it by multiplying by 6. So multiplying the top by 6, multiplying the bottom by 6. So you have to do it at the top, you have to do it at the bottom. We're going to write an equivalent fraction. 5/6 times 6, well, that's dividing by 6 and that's multiplying by 6. Those cancel out actually, and so you're left with a 5. So that converts to just a 5 up top. And on the bottom, we have 100. That's 100 times 6, that gives us 600. So to calculate, so now that's what 5/6% equals as a fraction, equals 5/600. Now you could, of course, simplify that fraction, 5/600. 5 goes into 5 one time, 5 goes into 600. Well, I know 5 goes into 100 20 times, so 20 times 6, that's going to be 120 times. So 1 out of 120. So that's what 5/6% is as a fraction. It's 1/20. This is why I didn't mention this method for this question, because it gets a little ugly, but it does still work. So if you wanted to do 1/20 times 600, I'm just going to do it real fast to show you that it works. 1/120 times 600. If you calculate this, you're going to get the exact same answer we got the first time, except you're not going to have to round. You're going to actually get 5. Before we do this, though, we're going to go ahead and we're going to simplify this fraction using the cross canceling. I see that we have 120 and we have 600, so we're gonna go ahead and use our cross simplifying shortcut real fast on that. So for both of these, 100, when we cross cancel, 120 goes into both of them. So it goes into 120 once, and 120 goes into 600 5 times. So we have up top 1 times 5, that's going to give us 5, and on bottom we have 1 times 1, that's going to give us 1. 5/1, that just equals 5. And so that's the exact same answer we got over here, and you'll notice that method required 0 rounding at any time. So that the fraction method was along the top right here, and then we came down here to actually multiply it where I had room. I want you guys to know that for these types of questions, it's not, in my opinion, I think you would agree, it's not really worth it to do the fraction method. I'm going to stick with the decimal method, which was just turning it, even if we have to round. But just know on a test or a quiz, or just for your own purposes, if you get an answer because you rounded during the problem, if you get an answer like 4.9999, it's really supposed to be 5. It just couldn't be 5 because you rounded. It wasn't possible. So we're going to apply that same skill real fast to number 18. We're not going to spend as much time on it, and this is going to be our last example. So in number 18, we're going to turn this into a decimal, but before we do, let's turn this fraction portion into a decimal so we can have 30 point something %, and then we'll turn that into a decimal and then actually multiply. So 1/3, we learned back in chapter 2, that's one of those common fractions. 1/3 is going to turn into 0.33, and the 3's go on forever. And so what we're going to do is we're just going to kind of round a little bit. We're going to have to figure the same thing out like we did last time. So that tells us that as a percentage, we'll keep it as a percentage still, is 30.3333%. I'm just going to throw a few 3's on there so we reduce how much we have to round. Now that percentage, remember it's still a percentage because all I did was turn that 1/3 into the decimal. Now we convert that to a decimal, and then we're ready to rock and roll and answer this question. So remember, converting to a decimal, you move it 2 times to the left. So that tells us we're really working with 0.30, and then just tack on a bunch of 3's. I don't really care how many you write because they go on forever. So that's kind of overkill how many I wrote, but I just wanted to show you that the concept is the same. So that multiplied by 3 is what we're looking to calculate. So I'm going to use a calculator to do that. I'm not expecting you to do this one in your head. So 0.30, and then I'm just going to hit 3 a bunch of times. That multiplied by 3. Okay, well that gave us 0.90 and then a bunch of 9's. The 9's going on forever, going on forever. So let's make sure we know what that means. Remember, these 9's I just said go on forever. And I mentioned to you guys that when that happens, it really means this next digit is supposed to be the next number. So go ahead, and besides, they said round to the nearest hundredth anyways. So even if we had done this question and rounded to the nearest hundredth, we still would have had to round up here, which would have caused us to round up here, which would have turned that into a 5. So if we just follow the instructions round to the nearest hundredth, the same thing's going to happen here. I'm not going to do this the ugly fraction method, but we are going to round this one to the nearest hundredth. So you go to the thousandths location, and that 9 tells us to round this one up. And that agrees with what we were talking about over here anyways. So that's going to round up to 0.91, and now that answer is rounded to the nearest hundredth, and that's going to be your final answer to this question. That is 30 1/3% of 3, which is less than 1/3 overall of 3, because 1/3 of 3, 1/3 is 33.3333%, and so this was a little less than that. So this answer needed to be less than 1, and so it was, and so that was a reasonable answer. So just remember, guys, when you're finding the percent of a number, just multiply that percent by the number. I don't care if you use fractions or decimals. However, you'll notice the method that was repeated the most was the decimal method. So take your time and work your way through these and make sure your answers are reasonable.